A helpless mother with a baby help a simple man unaware is a billionaire. The sun blazed without mercy as heat waves shimmered above the cracked pavement. Dust clung to everything: trees, shoes, skin. Amid the chaos of the world rushing by, she stood still, as if time itself had forgotten her. Her arms cradled a frail infant whose quiet, rasping cries pierced the heavy air. Each sound from the baby was a reminder of the fever tightening its grip. Sweat lined the child's forehead, yet his skin remained worryingly cool. She wiped it with a corner of her sleeve, though the cloth was already damp from her own sweat. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. The woman's clothes, once colorful, now faded and stained, hung loosely from her thin frame. Hunger had gnawed at her for days, yet her concern was only for the little life pressed to her chest. She gently rocked him, whispering words of comfort that barely rose above the noise of passing engines and hurried footsteps. People walked past. Some glanced her way. Most didn't. A few slowed, not to offer help, but to avoid stepping too close. She didn't beg. Not anymore. Her pride had crumbled long ago, yet something deeper still held her back. Perhaps it was dignity, or perhaps the quiet hope that someone would see her without being asked. A breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of roasted corn from a nearby vendor. Her stomach clenched, but she quickly turned her attention back to her baby, pressing a gentle kiss to his temple. His cries weakened, turning into soft whimpers. He was too tired to cry properly now. She shifted her weight from one foot to another, legs trembling beneath her. Each minute felt longer than the last, yet she didn't move from her spot. This dusty roadside had become her place of waiting, a place where she hoped help might someday arrive. Not in the form of charity, but in the form of mercy. A look, a word, a hand reaching out. Behind her, a rusty old bus honked as it sped off, leaving behind a burst of smoke. She coughed, shielding the baby with her arm, and when the dust settled, nothing had changed. Cars continued rushing by. People continued walking. Her world remained paused in that endless loop of hope and disappointment. Her eyes scanned the distance again, red from exhaustion. The baby stirred. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a tiny piece of hard bread, her last. It wasn't much, but she held it close, saving it for when he might accept a bite. He hadn't eaten since morning, just like her. Still, she waited. Not because she expected a miracle, but because walking away meant giving up. And she wasn't ready for that, not yet. Something deep inside her told her that moving too soon might mean missing the one person who would notice, the one who wouldn't pass her by. So she stood there, under the cruel sun, clutching her baby with all the strength she had left, and hoped. The wind had begun to shift, brushing softly over the scorched roadside, stirring loose dirt into the air. The woman barely noticed. She had grown used to the smell of exhaust fumes, the sting of heat, the dull ache that gnawed at her stomach. Her thoughts drifted in and out, half focused on the weight of her child and the unspoken plea in his feverish eyes. She was still, yet each second dragged her deeper into weariness. Then came the sound, slow, uneven, almost hesitant. A dragging rhythm that didn't match the hurried steps of passers-by. Not the confident stomp of businessmen or the swift click of heels. This sound was tired, worn. The kind of sound that belonged to someone who had walked far without any particular destination. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drawn toward the soft scrape of rubber against the pavement. A man approached, alone, his figure outlined against the dusty sky. He wasn't much to look at. Plain clothes that bore the memory of rain and long travel, a hat slightly askew on his head, and a suitcase with one wheel missing that scraped the ground behind him. His shoes had lost their shape, and dust coated the hem of his pants. He looked like someone who had slept in more alleys than beds. But there was something about him, an ease in his stride, a calm in the way he carried himself, as if the world's noise didn't touch him the same way it touched everyone else. The woman didn't flinch when he neared. She had long since learned that most men like him kept walking, eyes flicking past her with practiced detachment. But this one stopped. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his coat and pulled out a water bottle. Nearly full, condensation clinging to the plastic. He held it out. Not forcefully, not with pity, just quietly, as though he were handing it to a friend. She stared at it for a moment, uncertain. Her arms instinctively tightened around her baby, and her lips parted, as if to question his intention. But his eyes met hers, not sharp or searching, just steady. There was no judgment in them, no concern for who she was or why she was there. Only presence. Only offering. With careful hands, she accepted the bottle. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely rising above the distant hum of the street. He nodded, saying nothing. Dust swirled between them. She uncapped the bottle and tilted a few drops into the baby's mouth, watching as the child stirred weakly. Then she took a small sip herself. The water was warm, but it soothed her throat like rain on dry soil. She closed her eyes for a second, as though holding on to the quiet relief. When she opened them, the man had sat down on a low ledge nearby, still silent, suitcase leaning beside him. She studied him now, curious but cautious. He hadn't asked anything, hadn't stared, hadn't looked at her the way most did, with discomfort or with guilt. He was just there. She reached into the side of her dress, where a small scrap of cloth had been tied into a knot. From it, she pulled out a broken piece of bread, hardened from time, saved with intention. It wasn't much, barely enough for one. But something inside her stirred, a nudge of conscience, or perhaps gratitude. She hesitated only briefly before breaking the bread in two. Wordlessly, she extended one half toward him. He looked at the offering, then at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Not mockery, not refusal, just a pause, as though he hadn't expected it. Then he accepted, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. They sat in silence, sharing that meager meal. Two strangers on opposite ends of life's fortune, bound for a moment not by desperation, but by decency. The bread was tough, but neither complained. He finally spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You always give away your last bite?" She glanced down at the child in her arms, then at the empty road ahead. "Only to someone who needed it as much as I did." He said nothing more, but his eyes stayed on her for a moment longer, thoughtful. They didn't ask each other's names. She didn't wonder where he had come from, nor did he pry into her story. There was no need. The dust, the silence, the shared bread, those spoke enough. What she could never guess was that the man beside her, dressed like a drifter, was Jonathan Cross, a name that had built empires, shaped cities, appeared on headlines and charity walls. But here, he wore no title, carried no wealth. His hands were empty, his demeanor simple, his heart listening. She saw only a traveler, a stranger who stopped when no one else did. And he, for the first time in a long while, saw something more than numbers and polished deals. He saw a woman holding on, not to survival, but to kindness. There was no applause, no revelation. Just two souls passing a rare moment of human truth, unnoticed by the world hurrying past them. And as the dust settled and the sun shifted slightly in the sky, that quiet connection lingered, not loud, not obvious, but rooted deeply in something real. They sat beneath the broken shed, its rusted roof offering a modest patch of shade. The metal creaked with every faint gust of wind, and a few dry leaves danced in the dust at their feet. It was a forgotten place, tucked away from the main road, where no one looked twice. But it was quiet, and for now, that was enough. She shifted her baby gently in her arms, adjusting the cloth that wrapped around him like a second skin. His fever had not broken, but he slept, breath shallow, chest rising and falling like a paper lantern in wind. She brushed a curl from his damp forehead, her hand lingering for a moment longer than necessary. The man sat a few feet away, cross-legged on the ground, his back resting against a cracked pillar. He said nothing. His presence was neither loud nor pressing. He waited, not for her to speak, but for silence to stretch wide enough for truth to enter. And slowly, it did. She glanced at him, then away, scanning the road out of habit. Then her voice came, raw and even. "His name is Micaiah," she said, nodding to the child. "He's 1 year and 4 months today." The man gave a small nod, but still didn't speak. He didn't need to. "I was married," she continued. "Not long. 2 years, maybe. We were poor, but happy enough. My husband worked at a car parts factory. The pay wasn't much, but we managed." She paused, her eyes fixed on something distant, something only she could see. Then one morning, he left for work like always. Said he'd bring home groundnut soup from the corner place. He never came back. Her voice didn't break, but something beneath it did. They said it was a brake failure. Truck hit the side of the factory. He and 3 others. Gone just like that. She gave a small, tired laugh that held no humor. No warning. No goodbye. Not even soup. Silence settled again. The kind that carried weight. "I tried to hold things together," she went on. "I got work at a laundry place. Long hours, bad pay, but it was something. Then Micaiah got sick, malaria first, then pneumonia. I missed 3 days of work at the clinic. When I returned, someone else had my job." She didn't embellish. Her words were simple, stripped of drama, spoken like facts too often repeated in her mind. After that, it was selling bread, then ground nuts, then fetching water for people who could afford not to carry their own. Each day, something new. Each day, something less. Her voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. I don't ask for much, she said. Just enough to keep him warm, to keep him fed. Some days, I find that. Most days, I don't. She turned her head slightly, looking at the man, not in search of pity, but perhaps just to be sure he was still listening. He was. He hadn't looked away once. His expression hadn't shifted in judgment or pity. Only quiet presence. He didn't ask questions, didn't interrupt. And somehow, that allowed her to go on. I used to sing, she said suddenly. In church. My mother taught me. People said I had a strong voice. She smiled faintly. I haven't sung in months. My throat's too dry, and I worry if I try, the sound won't come out. The baby stirred. She adjusted her grip, rocking gently. Her hands were steady. She had done this 1,000 times, soothing a child while the world ignored them. The man finally spoke, his voice soft. You ever think about leaving the city? She looked at him, surprised. To go where? Anywhere else. She considered the question, eyes narrowing slightly. Sometimes. But everywhere's hard now. Some places, you might have land but no doctor. Other places, a doctor but no work. Here, at least I know the corners. I know where to sit when it rains and where the shopkeeper will let me stand in the shade. He nodded slowly, as if he understood. And somehow, she felt that he did. You listen well, she said. I try. Most people don't, she added. They hear a woman like me talking and think it's a trap. Like I'm trying to make them feel bad, or beg, or guilt them into something. But sometimes, we just need someone to hear the words. To let them exist. I believe that, he said. She leaned back against the wall of the shed. The iron felt hot through her clothes, but it grounded her. I don't hate life, she said quietly. I don't. I just get tired. Some days, the tired is louder than the hunger. The man didn't respond right away. His eyes rested on the child in her arms, then lifted to her face. You're strong, he said. She blinked, taken aback. Strong? He nodded. You've lost more than most, and you still carry him. Still share bread. Still speak. Her lips pressed together, unsure how to accept the compliment. It wasn't something she heard often, or ever. I'm just doing what a mother should, she replied. Not all do. The wind picked up again, whistling through the holes in the roof. A bird landed on the beam above them, hopping twice before flying off again. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the silence between them. There was peace in it, strange and brief, but welcome. When she opened them, the man was still watching her, still saying nothing more than necessary. And she was grateful. For the first time in many days, she didn't feel invisible. Not because of what she had shared, but because someone had truly listened. The wind had grown warmer, brushing against the shed like a lazy sigh. The shadows had shifted, stretching long and crooked across the ground. Time had moved quietly, unnoticed until now. The man glanced at his wrist, where a worn leather band framed an old watch. He looked at the hour, then at the woman and her sleeping child. A flicker passed through his expression, soft, thoughtful, and unreadable. I should be going, he said simply. The words felt too small, too quick. She looked up, surprised by their suddenness, and then nodded. There wasn't much to say. People came and went. Life never waited. Thank you, she said, voice steady despite the weight in her chest. For the water. And for listening. He gave her a small smile. It was the kind that didn't need words, the kind that said more than a goodbye. It was kind, gentle, reassuring in a way that made her feel, for a brief second, less alone. She watched him stand, his hand adjusting the strap of his battered suitcase. The handle was frayed, barely holding on, like it had been dragged through more roads than one man should have walked. He didn't offer any name, didn't ask for hers. He only dipped his head slightly and said, "Take care of him." "I will," she replied, her hand instinctively tightening around the child in her arms. And just like that, he turned and walked back toward the road. She remained seated, still beneath the rusted shed, watching his figure grow smaller in the distance. He didn't look back, not once. But something about his pace, calm, unhurried, felt different from all the passers-by she had watched before. When he vanished past the curve in the road, she exhaled slowly. It had been such a brief encounter, yet something in her felt lighter. Not in the belly, she was still hungry. Not in her arms, her son still burned with fever. But in the space between her ribs, Where fear usually sat, there was now a thin thread of calm. Perhaps it was just a stranger being kind. Perhaps it was just a rare moment of grace in a world that had offered her little. She leaned back, cradling her son gently, letting his small breath tickle the skin at her collarbone. His fever was still there, but he was resting. That was enough for now. She would return to her spot by the roadside soon. She knew people would keep walking, cars would keep rushing past, and life would go on ignoring her. That was how it had always been. But today, someone had stopped. Someone had shared water, broken bread, and listened. She didn't know his name, but somehow she knew she would remember him. Not because he had changed her world, but because, in a world full of silence, he had heard her. And for a moment, that had been everything. The iron gates opened without a sound. As he stepped inside, the world changed. From the outside, nothing about the quiet, worn man hinted at the life he returned to. The dust of the roadside still clung to his shoes, and the frayed edge of his sleeve brushed against the polished wood of the entranceway. But no one questioned him. No one dared. Every staff member who caught a glimpse straightened their backs, lips tight with professional respect. He nodded once, almost absently, as two assistants approached. "Welcome back, sir," one of them greeted. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved across the hall, marble floors gleaming under warm light, the hush of a grand piano untouched in the corner, portraits lining the walls of men in suits and women in pearls. This was a place built in quiet wealth. A world of silence and secrets, padded with thick carpets and guarded by loyalty. He walked through it like a ghost, still wearing the clothes of another life. "Prepare a report," he said at last. The assistant blinked, quick to respond. "Of course." "On what, sir?" "The woman," he replied, pausing by the staircase. He said it without elaboration, yet both assistants knew. He never said more than necessary. His words were always clipped, precise, heavy with quiet authority. "Her name?" one asked gently. "I didn't ask." They exchanged a look, but didn't press further. "She's alone," he continued. "Child. No help. She's surviving by instinct." He didn't sit. Didn't remove his coat or shoes. He stood still, shoulders drawn tight, as if he were holding something in. The day's heat had left his skin dry, but it was not discomfort that gripped him now. Discreetly, he added, after a breath. "No noise. No attention. I want to know everything, where she sleeps, what she eats, what she's owed." "Yes, Mr. Cross." The name hung in the air like a note struck on glass. Jonathan Cross. To the public, he was a rumor. A billionaire without a face, whispered about in finance circles and gossip pages. There were stories. He once lived on a boat for a year. He owned a forgotten island. He hadn't spoken to his board in months. No one knew for sure. But behind these walls, he was real, and his word was law. He moved through the house in silence, his steps echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. A quiet trail followed him, staff adjusting the thermostat, a butler nodding from the hallway, a chef standing idle in the kitchen, unsure whether to begin dinner or wait for further instruction. But Jonathan wasn't hungry. He stopped by the window at the end of the hall, where the city blinked faintly in the distance. Out there, she was probably sitting back in that broken shed or by the roadside, her child curled against her chest. The image hadn't left his mind. He had met many people in his life, executives, politicians, performers. They spoke in numbers and polished lines. They calculated kindness, measured worth and returns. But she hadn't asked for anything. Not even when her hands trembled with fatigue. Not even when her child burned with fever. She gave him stale bread in return for water, and her eyes never searched his for pity. Only presence. Only listening. He found that rare. No one had ever handed him anything out of pure intention. Not without expecting some gain in return. And now, standing inside a house with ceilings high enough to swallow cathedrals, he realized how far he had drifted from that kind of humanity. "Would you like to sit, sir?" a voice asked gently from behind. He turned, eyes landing on Elise, his personal aide. "I'm fine." She gave a soft nod, used to his brevity. "You seem distant," she said carefully. "More than usual." Jonathan looked back out the window. "She reminded me of someone." "Someone important?" He paused. "Someone real." The words hung between them like a suspended truth. Elise didn't ask more. She had worked for him long enough to know when silence mattered more than explanation. "Have the guest suite prepared," he said after a while. "The far one. Simple furnishings. Nothing extravagant. For you or someone else?" "For her. If she ever comes." Elise hesitated. "Does she know who you are?" "No." "Should she?" "Not yet." The silence returned. Jonathan turned from the window and walked down the corridor toward the west wing. The sun filtered through long glass panes, casting gold across the floors. It was the same house he had lived in for years, but today it felt unfamiliar. Too large, too polished, too far from the shed where a woman's quiet courage had shown him more dignity than any boardroom ever had. He entered his study, a room lined with books and quiet leather chairs. The walls were thick, soundproof to keep the world out. He sat for the first time since arriving, the chair creaking beneath him. Across from him, a photograph sat on the desk, a younger version of himself, standing beside his late mother. She had been a woman like the one he met today, strong hands, steady eyes, no trace of luxury, but rich in love. He touched the frame lightly. Then he reached for the notepad beside it and wrote 2 lines. No more waiting. Help quietly. Restore dignity, not pride. He tore the page and placed it in the drawer. Outside, the estate carried on. Staff shifted silently, preparing the room, making notes, initiating inquiries that would uncover every corner of the woman's life without a single knock on her door. And Jonathan Cross, the man behind the billions, leaned back in his chair, not as an investor or magnate, but as someone changed by a moment too brief to measure and too powerful to ignore. The early morning sun filtered through the cracks of the shelter's worn curtains, casting soft, angular shadows across the floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp concrete and old wood. Yet, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the small space felt like a haven, if only for a moment. The mother sat on the edge of a folding cot, her child asleep in her arms. His fever had broken during the night, leaving her feeling a quiet relief that settled in her bones, even if the exhaustion never fully left. She hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks, but today, the weight seemed just a little lighter. She held him close, rocking gently, staring out the small window that looked onto the street. Life outside moved as it always did, people rushing, cars honking, voices blending in the distance. She often wondered if anyone noticed her, if anyone saw her sitting there. She wasn't sure anymore if she even wanted them to. Her world had shrunk to the size of the cot she sat on and the slivers of light that filtered in. But today was different. A sleek car rolled up to the curb outside the shelter, its polished black body gleaming even under the gray sky. She barely noticed it at first, too wrapped up in her own quiet thoughts. But the sound of the engine idling brought her attention to the outside world, and her gaze lifted, a flicker of curiosity stirring inside her. The car door opened smoothly, and a woman in a professional dress stepped out, holding a folder of documents. She walked toward the shelter with purpose, but without haste, her demeanor calm and collected. The mother's instinct flared. Who was this woman, and why was she here? Before she could even gather her thoughts, the woman stopped in front of the door and knocked lightly. The shelter attendant, a tired woman who always seemed a few steps behind, let her in without question, barely raising an eyebrow at the woman's polished appearance. The mother watched as the woman approached her with a gentle smile. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice smooth and professional but with a warmth that didn't quite fit the coldness of the street outside. "Are you the one who's been staying here?" The mother blinked, confused by the directness of the question. "Yes," she replied, her voice hesitant. I am." The woman nodded and glanced around briefly before her eyes returned to the mother. "I've been asked to bring you something, if you're willing to come with me." The words hung in the air, offering a strange invitation. "Asked to bring me something?" the mother repeated. Who asked?" "Someone who's heard about you," the woman said, her smile never faltering. "Someone who would like to help." The mother's heart raced in her chest. Was it a scam? Was someone trying to take advantage of her? She glanced at her baby, instinctively tightening her grip around him. But something in the woman's eyes, something soft and patient, spoke to a part of her that still believed in the goodness of people. The woman held out her hand, offering the folder. "I understand if you're hesitant, but you'll be safe. This isn't a trick." The mother hesitated. She didn't trust easily anymore. The world had shown her time and again that safety wasn't something that could be taken for granted. But what did she have to lose? She couldn't stay here forever. The shelter was a temporary refuge at best, and her options were running out. She needed something, anything, that could promise her a way forward. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice soft with uncertainty. "But my baby." "He can come with us," the woman assured her, nodding toward the child in her arms. "There's no need to leave him behind." And so, they left together, the woman leading her through the streets to the waiting car. The journey felt too quick, too unreal. One moment she was sitting in a cold, dimly lit shelter. The next, she was gliding through the city in the backseat of a luxury vehicle, her baby cradled tightly in her arms. The car turned into a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, its streets lined with modest, well-maintained homes. It was a world far removed from the chaos and poverty of her own existence. The contrast struck her like a jolt, her pulse quickening as they pulled up in front of a small house. It wasn't grand, but it was new, freshly painted, and clearly well cared for. The woman stepped out first, holding the door open for her. She took a moment to steady her breath before following. She had no idea where this was leading, but curiosity had a tight grip on her. Inside, the house was small but warm, decorated with simple, inviting furnishings. There was a small living room, a kitchen stocked with food, and baby supplies neatly arranged on a table. It was as if the house had been prepared just for her. The smell of fresh bread and fruit lingered in the air, welcoming her into this strange, unexpected space. She stood at the threshold for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in reality. It felt like a dream, too good to be true. This couldn't be real, could it? Here, the woman said, her voice gentle but insistent, as she handed the mother a letter. This is for you. The letter was simple, handwritten in elegant script. She read the words aloud, her voice shaking. Kindness returns tenfold. The mother's fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. There, beneath the words, was a contract. The name on it made her heart stop for a moment, Jonathan Cross. The woman explained, this is a job offer from one of his companies. It's yours, if you choose to accept. He wanted you to know that you don't have to do this alone anymore. The mother's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the paper. The terms were fair, reasonable, even. A job. Security. A chance at a future she had stopped believing in. Tears welled in her eyes. She had not expected this, not in 1,000 lifetimes. A job offer was the last thing she thought she would ever receive. Yet here it was, wrapped in the form of an opportunity, a lifeline thrown to her when she had almost given up. Is this really? She couldn't finish the question. It's real, the woman replied softly, offering a reassuring smile. You deserve this chance. The mother's tears spoke louder than words ever could. Weeks had passed since the day that changed everything for the mother. She had settled into her new life with a quiet determination, the weight of uncertainty that once hung over her now replaced with a sense of purpose. Every morning, she woke early, the small house she and her baby called home warm and filled with the sounds of life. Her job at the administrative department of Jonathan Cross's company was more than just work. It was a fresh start, a second chance. Her baby, now healthy and growing stronger, played on the floor as she worked from home on days when she wasn't required to be in the office. The routine of it all had begun to feel normal, even comforting. She'd made friends with some of the employees, and slowly, her confidence began to rebuild. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. That morning, however, something felt different. There was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air as she entered the company building for her usual shift. Her coworkers seemed unusually tense, whispering to one another, exchanging glances she couldn't quite read. She shrugged it off, perhaps there was an important meeting. But as the hours ticked by, she found herself summoned to a conference room. It wasn't her usual routine, and the sudden request to attend felt out of place. Her heart began to beat a little faster as she walked through the hallway, the familiar surroundings now feeling unfamiliar, the distance from her quiet office room to the large meeting space making her feel more anxious with each step. She could hear murmurs behind the door before she entered, but when she did, the room fell silent. Sitting at the head of the long, polished table was Jonathan Cross, the man who had quietly changed her life. But now, he wasn't the man she had first met on the side of the road. Gone was the humble figure with the dusty suitcase. In front of her was the real Jonathan Cross, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, the billionaire businessman in his full, commanding presence. His demeanor was calm, yet there was a warmth in his eyes as he looked up from the documents in front of him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The weight of the situation hit her all at once. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. This was the man she had unknowingly shared a brief moment of kindness with weeks ago, the same man who had tested her in ways she hadn't understood then. He smiled at her, his expression both kind and knowing. There was no arrogance in his gaze, only a deep understanding that reached beyond the surface. I had to see for myself, Jonathan said softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken words. I needed to know if real kindness still exists in this world. The room was still, save for the soft sound of her breath as she processed the revelation. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. The man who had given her the water, the man who had quietly helped her without asking for anything in return, he wasn't just any stranger. He was Jonathan Cross, the man whose generosity had saved her, the man who had turned her life around with nothing more than a simple act of kindness. The realization left her speechless, and before she knew it, tears began to well in her eyes. She couldn't help it. The emotions that had been building for weeks came crashing down on her. Gratitude, relief, disbelief, everything she had kept locked inside for so long poured out in that moment. I don't know what to say, she whispered through the tears, her voice breaking. You changed my life. Jonathan's smile deepened, and he stood, walking around the table to stand before her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. You don't need to say anything, he replied gently. You're here now, and that's what matters. You've shown me what true strength looks like. It's not in wealth, it's not in power, it's in compassion, in humanity. That's something worth investing in. The mother's heart swelled with emotion, the weight of her past struggles seeming to melt away under his words. She had fought for so long, alone and afraid, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be heard, to be valued simply for who she was. As she looked at Jonathan, she realized that his wealth was not in his money or his businesses. It was in his heart, in the way he cared for others, in the way he believed in humanity. And that was worth more than anything the world could offer. The room fell silent once again, the weight of the moment settling in, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence filled with understanding, with connection. A quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both been on, and where it had led them. As the mother stood, tears still glistening in her eyes, Jonathan nodded once more. He said nothing more, but his presence spoke volumes. And as the scene came to an end, a simple message appeared on the screen, softly illuminating the quiet room. True wealth lies in compassion. It was a message that would linger long after the credits rolled, a message that would echo in the hearts of anyone who had witnessed this story of kindness, struggle, and the power of human connection. If you enjoyed this story, ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing, heartfelt stories like this. Also, let us know where you are watching from, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.